Did you know that Fidel Castro, the infamous Cuban leader, survived over 600 assassination attempts? That's right, the man who ruled Cuba for nearly 5 decades, outwitted and outlived his enemies in a remarkable testament to his survival instincts. From poisoned cigars to explosive seashells, the methods devised to end Castro's life were as varied as they were numerous. But who exactly was Fidel Castro, and how did he manage to survive such relentless attempts on his life? Well, let's dive into it. Fidel Castro, born on August 13, 1926, was not always destined for a life of power. Brought into the world in the heart of Biran, Cuba, Fidel Castro's early life was marked not by political intrigue, but by the rustic simplicity of a farming family. His parents, Angel Castro and Lina Ruz Gonzalez, were prosperous sugar plantation owners, providing young Fidel with a comfortable upbringing that was far removed from the trials of political leadership. In contrast to the humble locales of his early years, Castro's education was a vibrant affair. His academic journey took him from a rural public school to the esteemed halls of the University of Havana. It was here, in this bustling hive of intellectual activity, that Castro's political consciousness began to awaken. At the University of Havana, Castro dove headfirst into the world of law, immersing himself in the study of social justice, politics, and governance. It was in these halls of learning that he became a vocal critic of corruption and inequality, gaining a reputation for his passionate speeches and fiery debates. Yet, Castro's education extended far beyond textbooks and classrooms. The university was a hotbed of political activism, where students regularly took to the streets to protest injustices. Castro was no mere spectator in these events. He was an active participant, organizing strikes and leading demonstrations. This was Castro's first taste of leadership, and it was clear he had a knack for it. His experiences at the University of Havana did more than mold his political ideology. They set the stage for his future role as a revolutionary leader. Castro's time at the university was a crucible, tempering his resolve, honing his leadership skills, and defining his vision for a new Cuba. It was here, amidst the fervor of student activism and the rigors of academic pursuit, that Castro's path to power began to take shape. And while his journey would be fraught with challenges, his early experiences laid the groundwork for the leader he would become. From his early days, Castro demonstrated a fierce determination and a knack for leadership that would shape his future and the future of Cuba. Castro's political journey began in earnest with a failed coup. With this bold move on July 26, 1953, a young lawyer named Fidel Castro, along with a small band of rebels, attacked the Moncada barracks in Santiago de Cuba. The aim was to overthrow the dictator Fulgencio Batista, but the operation ended in disaster. Many were killed, and Castro was captured, tried, and sentenced to 15 years in prison. However, Castro's imprisonment didn't silence him. Instead, it amplified his voice. During his trial, he delivered a speech that became a manifesto for revolutionaries, famously ending with the line, "History will absolve me." His words resonated with many Cubans who were disillusioned with Batista's regime. In 1955, under mounting political pressure, Batista released Castro as part of a general amnesty. Castro, bolstered by new vigor and determination, fled to Mexico, where he met with Argentine revolutionary Ernesto Che Guevara. Together, they formed the 26th of July movement, named after the date of the failed Moncada assault. They returned to Cuba in 1956 on board a boat named Grandma with a small force of just over 80 men. Despite initial setbacks and a force greatly reduced in numbers, they waged a guerrilla war against Batista's government from their base in the Sierra Maestra Mountains. Castro's charisma, combined with the brutal tactics of Batista's forces, swayed public opinion in their favor. The turning point came in 1958 when Castro's forces won a significant victory at the Battle of Santa Clara. Batista, realizing his time was up, fled the country on New Year's Eve. On January 1, 1959, Fidel Castro marched into Havana, victorious. The Cuban Revolution had succeeded. Castro, the once imprisoned revolutionary, was now the leader of Cuba. With the success of the revolution, Castro assumed power, marking the beginning of a new era for Cuba. For many, Castro's reign was a time of significant change. Fidel Castro, once a revolutionary, now found himself in the seat of power. He began his reign with a vision of Cuba that was divergent from the past, a vision of a socialist utopia. Castro's Cuba was to be a one-party socialist state, a stark departure from the previous regime. His focus: equality, education, and healthcare for all, regardless of their social status. Under Castro's leadership, Cuba was transformed into a one-party socialist state. He abolished the multi-party political system that had previously existed, instead establishing the Communist Party of Cuba as the only legal party. This move, while controversial, centralized power and allowed Castro to implement his socialist policies without opposition. Education was a cornerstone of Castro's reign. He believed that education was the key to creating a society of informed and engaged citizens. To this end, he launched a nationwide literacy campaign, aiming to eradicate illiteracy in Cuba. The campaign was a success, and Cuba's literacy rate skyrocketed, becoming one of the highest in Latin America. Healthcare was another area where Castro focused his efforts. He established a universal healthcare system, providing free healthcare to all Cubans. This was a radical shift from the previous system, where healthcare was often out of reach for the poorest citizens. Under Castro's system, doctors were dispatched to the remotest corners of the island, ensuring that everyone had access to medical care. However, Castro's reign was not without controversy. His policies often put him at odds with the United States, culminating in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Castro's decision to allow the Soviet Union to construct nuclear missile sites in Cuba brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. This standoff between two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, is one of the most notable events of the Cold War. Castro's stance against the United States was a defining aspect of his leadership. He was unyielding in his opposition to American imperialism and was determined to maintain Cuba's sovereignty at all costs. This stance earned him both criticism and admiration, further polarizing opinions of his leadership. Throughout his reign, Castro faced many challenges. He navigated through economic crises, numerous assassination attempts, and the collapse of the Soviet Union, Cuba's main ally and economic partner. Yet, despite these challenges, Castro held on to power, remaining Cuba's leader for almost 5 decades. His leadership has left an indelible mark on Cuba. His socialist policies transformed the nation's education and healthcare systems, and his stance against the United States shaped Cuba's foreign policy for years to come. His reign was a time of significant change, a time when Cuba was reshaped in the image of its leader. Despite many challenges, Castro held on to power for almost 5 decades, shaping Cuba in his image. Castro's death in 2016 marked the end of an era. The Iron Curtain of his leadership was finally drawn, leaving behind a Cuba forever marked by his influence. But before we delve into the aftermath of his passing, let's rewind a decade to the year 2006. Castro's health began to wane, and with it, the vigor that had propelled his rule for nearly half a century. It was during this time that Castro made a decision that would signal the beginning of the end. He stepped down from power, passing the baton to his younger brother Raúl. It was a move that shocked the world, but also one that showcased Castro's pragmatism. He understood the limitations of his health and chose to ensure the continuity of his government over clinging to power. Fast forward to November 25, 2016, a day that would go down in history. Fidel Castro, the man who had defied 11 US presidents and survived 634 assassination attempts, finally succumbed to the inevitable end that comes to all men, death. It was a moment that reverberated around the globe, triggering a wave of reactions as diverse as the man himself. In Cuba, the streets were filled with an outpouring of grief. Castro was not just a leader to them, he was a symbol of resistance and resilience. His death marked the loss of a figure who, for better or worse, had shaped the identity of the nation. Yet beyond the borders of Cuba, there was celebration. To many, Castro's death symbolized the end of a regime marked by human rights abuses and economic hardship. They celebrated the hope for a new beginning, a Cuba free from the grasp of Castro's ideology. Castro's legacy is a complex one, marked by both fierce loyalty and vehement opposition. He was a man who evoked extremes, a symbol of revolution and resistance, but also of repression and economic hardship. His death left behind a Cuba forever imprinted by his rule, a country navigating the waters of a post-Castro era. Fidel Castro, the man who survived over 600 assassination attempts, is no doubt a figure of significant historical importance. From his early days to his rise to power, Castro's life was marked by a relentless pursuit of his vision. His reign, though controversial, brought about significant changes in Cuba and beyond. His death marked the end of an era, but his legacy continues to shape the world. Whether viewed as a champion of the people or a ruthless dictator, Fidel Castro's influence on Cuba and the world is undeniable.